The wind possessed a dry, rasping voice that day, a sound that scoured the high plains until the buffalo grass lay flat and gray against the hard earth. It was a landscape stripped of color, bleached by a sun that offered no warmth, only a blinding, white glare. Above the rolling expanse of the prairie, the sky stretched out like a taut canvas, high and indifferent, broken only by the erratic dance of dust devils that spun across the open ground. They rose and fell like restless ghosts, picking up grit and dead sage, whirling it into the air before collapsing back into nothingness. Through this desolation cut the railway line, 2 ribbons of iron laid down by sweat and blood, stretching toward a horizon that seemed to retreat the further one traveled. It was a scar on the land, a reminder of a world that was trying to force its way into the wilderness. But out here, the wilderness was still winning. Elias Thorne rode into the town of Blackwood with the posture of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be rested. His horse, a sturdy bay with a coat matted by sweat and trail dust, walked with a heavy, plodding rhythm, its head low. Elias looked little better. The dust of the territory had settled into the deep lines around his eyes and the creases of his coat, turning him into a figure carved from the very earth he rode upon. He was a large man, but he carried himself with a quietness that made him seem part of the background, a shadow passing through the noon light. He had been out on the range for 3 weeks, pushing strays out of the deep arroyos before the winter snows could trap them. His body ached with a dull, familiar thrum, but his mind was the heavier burden. It happened whenever he was too tired, or when the wind howled in a certain pitch. The memory would flash, jagged and bright, the rumble of 1,000 hooves, the ground shaking so hard it rattled his teeth. And then, the sound that woke him in the middle of the night, even 10 years later, the scream of a younger brother, Samuel. Elias shook his head, a sharp, physical jerk to dislodge the thought. He patted the neck of his horse, his gloved hand lingering on the coarse mane. He needed to focus. Today was not a day for ghosts. Today was a day that required a different kind of courage. As he guided the bay down the main thoroughfare of Blackwood, he felt the eyes of the town upon him. Blackwood was a collection of false-fronted buildings and raw timber, holding on to the edge of the valley with the desperation of a drowning man. The people here were hard, worn down by wind and isolation, and they had long memories. 2 men leaning against the railing of the livery stable stopped their conversation as Elias passed. They tipped their hats, but the gesture was stiff. It was the kind of respect born of caution, not affection. They knew the stories. They whispered that Elias Thorne had ice in his veins, that he had watched his own brother trampled into the mud without lifting a hand because he was too paralyzed by fear. That was the charitable version. The darker rumor, the one spoken only in the dim corners of the saloon, was that he had let Samuel die to inherit the ranch alone. And then there was the other matter, the grave on the hill of a man who had drawn a knife on Elias over a cattle dispute 5 years ago. Elias had not started the fight, and the law had cleared him. But the violence of it, the efficient, brutal way Elias had ended it, had left a mark on the town's consciousness. They left him alone, and he gave them no reason to do otherwise. Elias dismounted in front of the post office, tying the bay to the hitching rail. He beat the dust from his hat against his leg, the sound sharp in the quiet street. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of ink and dry paper. The postmaster, a thin man with spectacles that magnified his nervous blinking, looked up and cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne," the postmaster said, his voice thin. "I have the letter you were expecting." Elias took the envelope. His hands were large, the knuckles scarred and the skin rough as bark, making the paper look impossibly fragile. He did not open it immediately. He knew what it said. He had sent the money orders. He had placed the advertisement in a Chicago newspaper 6 months ago. A simple request that felt like a confession of weakness. Rancher seeks wife. Must be willing to work. Remote location. Kindness offered in exchange for loyalty. He was drowning on the high country ranch. The work was too much for one man, even a man who worked until his hands bled. But it was not just the labor. It was the silence. The silence in the cabin at night was a physical weight, heavy enough to crush a man's chest. He wanted a family. He wanted the sound of a voice that wasn't his own, or the wind, or the lowing of cattle. He opened the letter. It was brief, written in a neat, sharp hand. She was on the stagecoach due to arrive at 2 o'clock this very afternoon. Her name was Greta. Elias folded the paper and placed it in his breast pocket, near the beat of his heart. He checked the regulator clock on the wall. It was 1:15. He walked out into the blinding light to wait. The heat rose in shimmering waves off the hard-packed dirt of the street. Elias stood in the shadow of the general store, his arms crossed, watching the southern road. The town was waking up from its midday lull. A wagon loaded with lumber rattled past. A group of women in faded calico dresses walked toward the dry goods store, their bonnets pulled low against the sun. Then he saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. It was a brown smear against the pale sky, growing larger and more violent as it approached. The stagecoach. The vehicle crested the low ridge south of town, rocking violently on its leather thoroughbraces. The 6 horses pulling it were lathered in foam, their chests heaving as they fought the incline. The driver cracked his whip, a sound like a pistol shot, urging them on. The coach was caked in the gray mud of the river crossings and the white dust of the flats. It looked like a vessel that had survived a war. It rumbled down the main street, the heavy wheels grinding against the stones, and pulled up in front of the hotel with a lurching halt. Dust billowed out, coating the bystanders in a fine, choking powder. The door of the coach swung open. A businessman in a plaid suit stepped out first, coughing into a handkerchief. Then a woman with a pinched face and a crying infant. The driver climbed down and began unstrapping trunks from the boot. Elias watched, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked for a woman who might match the letters he had exchanged. He expected someone tired, perhaps small and worn down by the journey. Then a boot appeared on the metal step of the coach. It was a sturdy, worn boot, not a delicate city shoe. A hand gripped the door frame, a large, capable hand with broad fingers. Greta stepped down. The movement seemed to take a long time, simply because there was so much of her. When her boots hit the dirt, she straightened to her full height, and a hush rippled through the small crowd gathered on the boardwalk. She was tall, not simply tall for a woman, but tall for a man. She stood over 6 feet, her shoulders broad and square beneath the fabric of a simple gray woolen dress that had been let out at the seams and still pulled tight across her back. Her hair was the color of wheat straw, pulled back severely into a heavy braid that hung down her spine. But stray wisps had escaped, framing a face that was strong-boned and flushed with the heat. She towered over the businessman who had exited before her. She looked like a monolith, something carved from the granite of the mountains themselves. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Then, a boy near the water trough giggled. A woman whispered behind her hand to her neighbor, the word giant carrying clearly on the dry air. Elias stayed in the shadows, watching. He saw Greta's posture stiffen. He saw her chest rise and fall in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Greta Hansen focused on the wooden sign of the hotel. "Keep your chin level," she told herself. "Count the breaths. 1, 2, 3. The air here was thin and tasted of dust and sage. So different from the damp, heavy air of the city she had left, or the green fjords of her childhood. Her skin prickled. She could feel their eyes crawling over her, mapping the impossible length of her limbs, the width of her waist, the size of her hands. It was always the same. It did not matter if it was Chicago or St. Louis or this God-forsaken outpost at the edge of the world. She was a spectacle, a curiosity. She remembered the carnival barker who had approached her father when she was 12, offering money to put her in a tent next to the bearded lady. She remembered the shame that had burned in her gut, hot as coal. "Just this once more," she thought, gripping the handle of her battered carpet bag until her knuckles turned white. "I only have to endure this one last time. Then I will go to a ranch miles from here, and I will work. and I will belong. She scanned the crowd, looking for the man she'd come to marry. His name was Silas Vane. His letters had been flowery, speaking of his successful shop and his need for a companion. He had not asked for a photograph, and she had not offered one. She had written that she was strong and healthy. That had been the truth. A man stepped off the boardwalk. He was a small man, dressed in a suit that was too fine for the dust, with sharp, rat-like features and hair slicked down with oil. He held a piece of paper in his hand, waving it like a flag. "Miss Hanson?" the man asked. His voice was high and reedy. Greta turned to him. She had to look down, a significant distance. "Yes, I am Greta. You are Mr. Vane." Silas Vane stopped 3 feet away from her. He looked at her boots. He looked at her hips, wide and sturdy. He looked up, craning his neck to see her face. His expression shifted from curiosity to shock, and then to a twisting, ugly sneer. He laughed. It was a short, barking sound that lacked any humor. "Is this a joke?" Vane asked, looking around at the crowd, playing to his audience. "I am here as we agreed," Greta said. Her voice was low, accented with the hard consonants of her homeland. But it did not waver. "Agreed?" Vane crumpled the paper in his hand. "I ordered a wife, madam. I did not order a plow horse in a dress." The crowd erupted. It was a release of tension, a cruel, jagged laughter that tore through the air. Men slapped their thighs. Women covered their mouths, but their eyes danced with malicious delight. Greta felt the blood drain from her face. The laughter was a physical blow. It was the sound of every schoolyard, every street corner, every rejection she had ever known, magnified 1,000 times. She stood frozen, a statue of humiliation, too large to hide, too exposed to flee. "Look at the size of her," someone shouted. "She could pull the wagon herself." "Save the horses," another voice called out. Vane stepped closer. Emboldened by the crowd, the advertisement said, "A woman of strong constitution." It did not mention you were a freak of nature. "I run a respectable business. How would it look if I had a giantess behind the counter?" "You would scare the children. I traveled 2,000 miles, Greta said, her voice barely a whisper. "I spent everything I had. Then you best start walking back," Vane said, turning his back on her. "Or join a circus. I hear they pay well for your kind." The laughter surged again, a wave of heat and noise. Greta stood alone in the center of it, her vision blurred, the world tilted. She was 26 years old, and she had never felt more like a frightened child. Elias Thorne felt a cold, hard knot tighten in his chest. The anger did not flare up hot and fast. It rose slowly, like water in a flood, dark and irresistible. He remembered standing by the corral fence 10 years ago, watching the foreman berate Samuel. He remembered Samuel's face, pale and terrified, as the men laughed at his clumsiness. Elias had done nothing then. He had thought it would toughen the boy up. He had been wrong. He looked at Greta. She was not crying. She was standing with her spine straight, taking the abuse as if she believed she deserved it. That broke him more than tears would have. Elias stepped out of the shadows. His boots made a heavy, decisive sound on the boardwalk planks. He walked into the dusty street, moving with a momentum that parted the crowd. He did not look at the onlookers. He looked only at Silas Vane. "That is enough," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it had a resonance that cut through the laughter like a knife through canvas. The crowd quieted, the sound dying away into nervous coughs. Silas Vane turned, annoyance flashing in his eyes, until he saw who had spoken. Vane took a step back. "Elias, this is none of your concern. I am simply handling a business disappointment. You are shaming a woman who has traveled across the country on your word," Elias said. He stopped a few feet from the shopkeeper. Elias was an inch or two taller than Greta, but he was broad with muscle and heavy with the threat of violence. Beside him, Vane looked like a child's toy. "She deceived me," Vane sputtered, gesturing frantically at Greta. "Look at her. She is vast. She is a human being," Elias said. The words were flat, leaving no room for argument. And you brought her here. You will treat her with respect. I will not marry her, Vane squeaked. I will not have the town laughing at me. Elias looked at the shopkeeper with eyes that were the color of slate and just as hard. He thought of the empty cabin. He thought of the cattle dying in the drifts. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he had never sent to the papers, the one that simply asked for someone to help him bear the weight of the world. Then stand aside, Elias said. He turned his back on Vane and faced Greta. Up close. She was even more imposing. Her eyes were blue, the color of a mountain lake in winter, and they were wide with shock and wariness. He saw the calluses on her hands, thick and yellow. He saw the strength in her shoulders. He saw a survivor. He took off his hat, the dust falling from the brim. "Ma'am," he said. Greta looked at him. He was not handsome in the way the shopkeeper tried to be. His face was scarred, wind-burned, and covered in a rough shadow of beard. But he was not looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her with a calm, steady assessment. "I don't know you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "No, ma'am, you don't. My name is Elias Thorne. I have a ranch 30 miles north of here, in the high country. It is hard land. It is a hard life." He paused, searching for the words. He was not a man of speeches. "I need help," he said simply. "I need a partner who can work. I cannot offer you a fine house or a store in town, but I promise you this. If you come with me, no one will ever laugh at you again while I am drawing breath, and I will never look at you like you are anything less than a woman." The silence in the street was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Greta looked into his face. She searched for the cruelty she had come to expect from men. She found only a deep, weary exhaustion and a flicker of something that looked like hope. She looked at Silas Vane, who was watching with his mouth open. She looked at the crowd, who were now staring at Elias with a mixture of awe and confusion. She had a choice. She could try to beg for a ticket home, to return to the aunt who called her a burden and the cousins who mocked her size. Or she could take the hand of the stranger with the sad eyes and the scarred face. Survival. It was what she had always chosen. Greta took a breath. She squared her shoulders. "I work hard. Mr. Thorne," she said, "I can lift a calf. I can chop wood. I cook plain. But I cook plenty." Elias nodded slowly. "That is all I ask. Then I accept," she said. Elias held out his hand. She hesitated, then placed her own into it. Her hand was nearly as large as his, warm and strong. He squeezed it, a firm, solid pressure that anchored her to the earth. "Let us find the preacher," Elias said. The wedding took place an hour later in the small Baptist church at the edge of town. The building was little more than a shed with a steeple, the white paint peeling in long strips to reveal the gray wood beneath. Inside, the air was stiflingly hot. The floorboards were warped, curling up at the edges like dried leaves. The preacher was a young man with a sunburned nose who clearly wanted to be back at his dinner. He rushed through the words, stumbling over the liturgy. Elias stood beside Greta, his shoulder brushing against her arm. She smelled of lye soap and travel dust. There were no guests. The pews were empty, save for the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. Only one man stood at the back, Tobias, an old ranch hand who had known Elias since he was a boy. Tobias held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. He did not smile. He looked from Greta to Elias with a furrowed brow, his face etched with worry. He knew what the town would say. He knew how hard the winter would be. "Do you, Elias, take this woman?" "I do," Elias said. His voice was low in the empty room. "Do you, Greta?" "I do," she whispered. It was done. There was no kiss. Elias simply nodded to her, a solemn acknowledgement of the contract they had just signed with their lives. He paid the preacher $2, placing the coins on the table. "We should ride," Elias said. "It's a long way to the ranch, and the weather is turning." They walked out of the church into the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to bleed out behind the jagged teeth of the western mountains, turning the sky a bruised purple. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour. The wind had changed, no longer a dry rasp, but a sharp, cutting knife that smelled of ozone and coming moisture. Elias had rented a wagon from the livery to carry her trunk. Hitching the bay horse to the back, he helped Greta up onto the bench seat. She did not need his help, but she allowed him to take her elbow. His touch was careful, almost tentative. As he climbed up beside her, the wagon dipped under their combined weight. They sat shoulder to shoulder, two giants in a world that felt too small for them. Elias snapped the reins. The horses leaned into the harness, and the wagon lurched forward, rolling past the saloon where the piano was already playing, past the general store where Silas Vane was likely telling his version of the story to a captive audience, and out toward the open prairie. Greta looked straight ahead. The town faded behind them, swallowed by the dust. Ahead lay the mountains, dark and foreboding, their peaks shrouded in heavy, slate-gray clouds. A storm was building on the horizon, a massive wall of darkness that dwarfed the land below. She felt a shiver run through her, not from the cold, but from the vast, terrifying unknown that lay ahead. She was married to a stranger. She was riding into a wilderness that killed the weak. She glanced sideways at Elias. He was watching the storm, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed against the wind. He looked like he was ready to fight the sky itself if he had to. Greta clasped her hands in her lap. Count the breaths, she thought. 1, 2, 3. They drove on into the gathering dark, leaving the world of men behind. The ranch lay in a high, cupped palm of the mountains, a wide valley where the air was thin enough to make a person dizzy and the light had a sharp, cutting clarity. To Greta, stepping off the wagon that first evening, it had looked like the edge of the world. By the third day, she realized it was not the edge, but a fortress. The valley was ringed by dark, brooding pines that marched up the slopes like a silent army, stopping only where the granite peaks thrust upward into the perpetual snow. The cabin itself was a squat, weather-beaten structure of hewn logs, chinked with mud and straw that had hardened to the consistency of stone. It sat low to the ground, as if huddling against the wind that swept down from the divide. A leaning barn, its wood gray and silvered by years of sun and ice, stood 50 yards away, surrounded by a corral where a few horses stood with their tails to the wind. Beyond the buildings, the cattle were scattered across the frost-brittle grass. They were thin beasts, their ribs showing through their winter coats, scraping at the hard earth for sustenance. Greta had known work all her life. She had scrubbed floors in boarding houses until her knees were bruised blue. She had hauled coal in the biting winters of the city. But this was different. This land demanded a price for every hour of existence. On her fourth morning, Greta stood by the woodpile. The axe Elias had given her was heavy, the handle polished smooth by years of his grip. She set a round of pine on the stump. She took a breath, feeling the cold air fill her massive lungs. She swung, the blade bit deep, splitting the wood with a clean, sharp crack. The halves fell away. She swung again, and again. Back in the city, her size had been a clumsy thing. In the narrow hallways of the boarding house, she was always bumping into walls, knocking over vases, shrinking herself to fit into spaces designed for smaller, more delicate women. Here, under the open sky, her body made sense. Her broad shoulders, the object of so much ridicule, drove the axe down with a power that felt natural. Her long arms gave her leverage. She worked for an hour, the rhythm of the axe becoming a kind of meditation. Lift, swing, split. She did not have to hunch. She did not have to apologize for taking up space. Elias was repairing a bridle by the barn door. He did not speak to her, but she felt his eyes on her. He watched her not with the leering curiosity of the men in town, but with a quiet, measuring look. He saw the pile of wood growing. He saw the way she lifted the heavy rounds without grimacing. He respected work. She could see that already. He spoke little, moving through the days with a grim determination, as if he were trying to hold the entire ranch together by sheer force of will. That night, the arrangement of their lives settled into an uneasy pattern. The cabin had only one main room, dominated by a stone hearth and a small bedroom in the back. "You take the room," Elias had said the first night. dropping her bag by the door. "I sleep in the lean-to, but you cannot sleep outside," she had protested. "The frost is thick on the ground. It is insulated," he had answered, turning away to hide his face. "I have slept in worse places. I am used to the quiet." He was giving her space. She knew that. He was terrified of her, or perhaps terrified of the intimacy of a shared roof. He treated her like a skittish horse that might bolt if he moved too fast. So Greta lay alone in the bed that smelled of sage and old wool, staring up at the rough timber beams. The wind was a living thing up here. It howled through the gaps in the chinking, a mournful, hollow sound that seemed to carry the voices of the lost. Far off on the ridges, coyotes yipped and sang, their calls maniacal and lonely. She pulled the quilt up to her chin. In the dark, the doubts came crawling back, whispering in her ear. "You have traded one misery for another," the voice said. "He does not want a wife. He wants a hired hand who works for free. You are a monster here just as you were a monster there." She turned over, the bed frame groaning under her weight. She squeezed her eyes shut. She would not cry. She had promised herself she was done crying. A week later, the town came to them. It was a Sunday afternoon when a buggy rattled up the track. 2 women sat on the bench seat, their bonnets tied tight against the breeze. Greta, who was scrubbing laundry in a tub outside the door, straightened up, wiping her soapy hands on her apron. Elias was out on the range, checking the fence line. She was alone. The buggy stopped. The driver, a hired boy from town, stared at Greta with wide eyes before looking away. The women climbed down. One was tall and thin, with a face like a hatchet, Mrs. Higgins, the banker's wife. The other was round and soft, Mrs. Vance, who clutched a cloth-covered basket against her chest. "We have come to welcome you," Mrs. Higgins said. Her voice was brittle. We heard Elias had finally settled. Greta wiped a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Thank you. Please, come inside." She felt huge as she ushered them into the small cabin. "Mrs." Higgins' eyes darted around the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the lack of curtains, the man's boots by the door. "Mrs." Vance placed the basket on the table. "We brought bread and some preserves. We thought you might need the help. A ranch is a great deal of work for a woman." "I am managing," Greta said, moving to the stove to heat the coffee pot. "Mrs." Higgins sat on the edge of a chair, her back distinctively straight. She looked Greta up and down, her gaze lingering on Greta's waist, then moving down to her boots. "My, Mrs." Higgins said, "You certainly are. Sturdy. I suppose Elias needed someone of significant constitution. With the way things are out here." Greta paused with the coffee pot in her hand. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing, dear. Mrs." Vance chirped, though her eyes were sharp. "Just that folks talk. They say Elias has had a hard time keeping help. Men don't like to stay. They say the ranch is cursed, or that Elias is just difficult. A man with his history. Well, it takes a special kind of woman to live with a man who has killed." The word hung in the air. Killed. Greta set the pot down on the iron trivet. "He is a good man," she said. "Of course, Mrs." Higgins said, smoothing her skirt. "We are just concerned for your spiritual well-being. It must be frightening, being so far from civilization, and being so different." Greta felt the heat rising in her neck. It was not the flush of embarrassment anymore. It was the slow burn of anger. "Mrs." Vance nodded. "I told Mrs. Higgins on the ride over. I said, imagine the fabric it must take to clothe her. It is a blessing. I suppose. You can do a man's work. God gives us burdens we can bear. Isn't that right? They were inspecting her, like she was a prize heifer at the county fair, like she was a curiosity to be discussed over tea." Greta poured the coffee. Her hand did not shake. She placed the cups on the table. "I do the work that needs doing," Greta said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming flat and hard. "And I do not mind the isolation. It keeps the noise out. Mrs." Higgins blinked, sensing the shift in the air. She took a sip of the coffee and wrinkled her nose. It was strong. Cowboy coffee, thick enough to float a horseshoe. "We only meant to be neighborly, Mrs.," Higgins said, standing up abruptly. They did not stay long. They drank half a cup, left the dry loaf of bread, and retreated to their buggy as if fleeing a contagion. Greta stood in the doorway and watched them go. She felt hollowed out. The strength she had felt at the woodpile was gone, replaced by the familiar, sickening sensation of being a spectacle. She did not hear the horse approach. Elias rode up from the south, pulling the bay to a halt near the corral. He watched the dust of the departing buggy. He looked at Greta, standing in the doorframe. Her shoulders slumped. He dismounted and walked toward her. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his matted hair. "I saw the buggy," he said. "That was the banker's wife." "Yes," Greta said. She did not look at him. She looked at the ground. "What did they say?" Greta shrugged. One shoulder rose and fell. A heavy movement. "They brought bread. They wanted to see if I was as big as the rumors." Elias's jaw tightened. He looked at the horizon, where the clouds were gathering again. He slapped his hat against his thigh, a sharp sound of frustration. "I'm sorry," he said. Greta looked up, surprised. "You did not send them." "No," Elias said, "but I brought you here. I brought you into this. I know what they say. I know they look at us and see something they don't understand." He stepped closer. "Just one step. You are not a curiosity." "Greta," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel rolling in a stream bed. "You are my wife, and you are working harder than any 3 men in that town." He looked her in the eye, and for the first time, she saw it clearly. He was not ashamed of her. He was ashamed for her, angry that his world was bruising her. "Do not eat their bread," Elias said. "It is likely dry as dust anyway. I will shoot a rabbit for stew." He turned and walked toward the barn. Greta watched him go. Something small, like a seed buried deep in the winter earth, shifted inside her. It was not quite happiness, but it was the absence of loneliness. The days turned into weeks, and the season began to turn. The air grew sharper, biting at the skin. The sunsets became violent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and burning orange. One evening, they were out by the north pasture. A section of the split rail fence had come down, rotted by the damp. Elias was struggling with a heavy cedar post, trying to wedge it into the rocky soil. "Let me," Greta said. She stepped in. She wrapped her large hands around the post. She braced her legs, her boots sinking into the mud. With a grunt of effort, she lifted the post and slammed it into the hole Elias had dug. She held it steady, her muscles trembling with the strain. While he packed the earth and stones around the base, they worked in tandem, a silent machine. When the fence was secure, they stood back, breathing hard. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass. The light caught the scar on Elias's cheek, a jagged white line that ran from his ear to his jawbone. Greta felt bold. The work had made them equals for a moment. "How did you get it?" she asked quietly. Elias stiffened. He touched his face reflexively, his fingers tracing the old wound. "Get what?" "The scar." Elias turned away, picking up his shovel. "It does not matter. It matters to me," Greta said. "You are quiet. Elias, you carry things. I can see the weight of them." "I fell," he said shortly. "You did not fall," Greta said. "That is a knife wound." Elias spun around. His eyes were dark, flashing with a sudden, cold anger. "Do not dig. Greta," he warned. His voice was low. "We have a deal. You help me work. I give you a home. We do not need to cut each other open to see what is inside, but we are married," she said. "On paper," he snapped. He looked at her, and she saw the fear behind the anger, the terror of being known, the terror of being judged. "Look at the sky. We have work to do." He walked away, leaving her standing by the fence. Greta felt the sting of his rejection, but she also felt a strange pity. He was a man locked inside a fortress of his own making, and he had thrown away the key. That night, the weather did not just turn, it broke. Greta woke to a sound like a freight train roaring over the cabin. The wind was hitting the logs with such force that the whole structure shuddered. She sat up in the darkness. The temperature had plummeted. She could see her breath in the air, a white ghost in the gloom. "Elias!" she shouted. The door to the cabin burst open. Elias stumbled in from the lean-to, snow swirling around him in a blinding vortex. He was covered in white, his face red with cold. "The storm came down from the peaks," he yelled over the wind. "It is a blizzard. We have to get the stock in." Greta did not hesitate. She grabbed her coat, a heavy wool garment she had brought from the city, and pulled on her boots. She wrapped a scarf around her head. They went out into the white hell. The world had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only the driving snow that stung like buckshot. The wind knocked the breath out of them. They had to shout to be heard, even standing inches apart. "The barn!" Elias yelled. "Get the door open." Greta fought her way to the barn. The wind had caught the heavy door and was slamming it against the frame. She threw her shoulder against it, using all her weight to force it back and latch it. Inside, the horses were screaming, kicking at their stalls. Elias ran to calm them. "The calves!" Elias shouted. "The weanlings are in the lower pen. They will freeze in an hour. They ran back out." The snow was already drifting knee-deep. They stumbled toward the lower pen. The calves were huddled in a corner, buried in snow, bawling with terror. "Grab them!" Elias ordered. He grabbed a calf, wrestling it up into his arms. He staggered toward the barn. Greta grabbed another. It kicked and thrashed. 100 pounds of panicked muscle. She hoisted it up, holding it against her chest. They made 3 trips. On the 4th, Elias slipped. He went down hard on the ice, his leg twisting. The calf he was carrying bolted into the white darkness. "No!" Elias yelled, trying to rise. He fell back, grimacing. Greta dropped the calf she was holding into the safety of the barn and turned back. She saw Elias on the ground. She ignored him and ran into the dark after the lost calf. "Greta, come back!" Elias screamed. "You will get lost." She did not stop. She followed the bleeding sound. She waded through a drift that came up to her waist. The wind tried to tear the clothes from her body. She found the calf stuck in a tangle of sagebrush near the creek bed, shivering violently. It was too cold to walk. It had given up. Greta reached down. She grabbed the animal by the legs and heaved. She lifted it. It was dead weight, heavier than the others. She settled it across her shoulders, the way a shepherd would in the old pictures. She turned into the wind. She could not see the barn. She could not see Elias. She could only feel the cold burning her lungs. "Count the breaths," she told herself. 1 step, 2 steps. She walked blindly, guided only by the slope of the ground. Her legs burned. Her face was numb. She thought of the townspeople laughing. She thought of Silas Vane. "I am not weak," she thought. "I am not a freak. I am strong." A shape loomed out of the snow. The barn. She stumbled through the door and collapsed onto the straw. The calf slid off her shoulders. Alive. Elias dragged himself over to her. He had managed to crawl back to the barn. He was shivering uncontrollably, his face gray. "You came back," he whispered. Greta gasped for air. She sat up, wiping the snow from her eyelashes. "Of course. You carried it." "Yes." Elias looked at the calf, then at her. He looked at her broad shoulders, heaving with exertion. He looked at her red, raw hands. "I could not have done that," he said. His voice was shaking. "And not just from the cold. I could not have saved it." "We saved it," Greta said. They sat there in the straw, amidst the smell of wet wool and manure, while the storm raged outside, trying to tear the world apart. For the first time, the silence between them was not empty. It was full of shared survival. The storm broke just before dawn. Greta opened the barn door to a world transformed. The valley was buried under 2 feet of snow, a pristine, blinding white sheet that smoothed over the rough edges of the land. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. The sun rising over the peaks turned the snow to diamond dust. It was beautiful. It was deadly. She stood in the doorway. drinking coffee from a tin cup. Elias limped up beside her, leaning on a makeshift crutch he had fashioned from a pitchfork handle. His leg was swollen, but not broken. He looked out at the glittering expanse. "I owe you," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing," Greta said. "This is the work." "No," Elias said. He turned to face her. He looked her full in the face, without flinching, without looking past her. "I was wrong to think I could do this alone, and I was wrong to think that you were just a pair of hands to help." He paused. "You are made of iron. Greta." Greta felt a flush rise to her cheeks, warmer than the coffee. She looked out at the land. It was harsh. It was unforgiving. It killed the weak and the foolish. But looking at it now, under the blue light, she saw a reflection of herself. It was big, it was wild, and it was still standing. Maybe, she thought, she could survive here. Maybe this was the only place big enough to hold her. "Let us eat," she said. "I am hungry enough to eat a horse." Elias cracked a smile. It was a small thing, rusting and unused, but it was there. "I believe I have some dried venison," he said, "and maybe we can do better than that rock-hard bread." They went back into the cabin. The fire was roaring in the hearth. They sat at the rough table, eating the simple meal. "Tell me," Elias said, breaking the silence, "in your country, do they have snow like this?" Greta nodded. "More. The drifts can cover a house. My father, he used to tell stories of the frost giants." "Tell me," Elias said. And so she spoke. She told him of the fjords, of the dark winters, of the smell of fish and pine tar. She told him of her mother's recipes for rye bread. And Elias, in turn, spoke. He did not speak of his brother or the stampede. He did not speak of the man he killed. But he told her of learning to rope on the Texas plains. He told her how to tell the weather by the flight of the hawks. He told her which wood burned hottest and which burned longest. They circled the darkness in the center of the room, the ghosts of their pasts standing in the shadows. They did not name them. Not yet. But the circle was getting smaller, and the fire between them was getting a little brighter. Spring arrived not with a gentle unfurling of green, but with a violent, sloshing thaw that turned the high valley into a treacherous basin of mud. The snow, which had been a clean, white shroud all winter, collapsed into a heavy, glutinous paste that sucked the boots off a man and bogged horses down to their hocks. The trails became rivers, and the meadows became swamps. It was a season of brutal, filthy work. The winter drifts had crushed the corrals, snapping pine rails like dry kindling, and the runoff had washed out the footings of the barn. Greta and Elias worked from the first gray light of dawn until the sun dipped behind the peaks, their bodies caked in the dark earth of the territory. On a Tuesday in mid-April, they were rebuilding the main holding pen. The air smelled of wet sage, rotting pine needles, and the raw, mineral tang of mud. Greta stood knee-deep in the muck, holding the end of a heavy cedar beam while Elias hammered the other side into the post. "Lift it higher." Elias grunted, the hammer swinging in a steady rhythm. Greta braced her feet, feeling the cold seep through the leather of her boots. She inhaled, the air filling her massive chest, and shoved the beam upward. It was a piece of timber that would have required two ordinary men to maneuver, but she held it steady, the muscles in her arms corded and straining against the fabric of her sleeve. Elias drove the spike home. "Hold, one more." He paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead with his forearm, leaving a streak of dirt across the white scar on his cheek. He looked at her. He did not look away immediately. For months, they had moved around each other like planets in separate orbits, connected by the gravity of survival but separated by the vast distance of their own fears. But the mud had forced them close. They handed tools back and forth, their fingers brushing. They ate shoulder to shoulder on the porch step because the cabin was too hot. Elias watched her hold the beam. He watched the way her jaw set with effort, the way her hair, escaping from its braid, stuck to her damp neck. He saw the sheer, undeniable power of her body. But for the first time, he did not just see its utility. He saw the grace in it. She was not clumsy. She was solid. She was an anchor in a world that was always trying to wash him away. Greta caught him staring. She lowered the beam as he finished the nailing, her breath coming in short puffs. "Is there dirt on my face?" she asked, self-conscious, raising a hand to her cheek. Elias looked at her hand, large, calloused, stained with the soil of his land. His chest tightened, a strange, constricting sensation that had nothing to do with the altitude. "You are strong, Greta," he said. It was not a compliment paid to a hired hand. It was spoken low, almost intimately. Greta looked down, flushing. "I have always been strong. It is the only thing people let me be." Elias stepped down from the rail. He stood close to her in the mud. He could smell the sweat on her, and the scent of pine pitch. "It is a good thing to be," he said. Just then, a calf in the near pasture bleated and stumbled, slipping in the mire. Greta laughed, a low, throaty sound that surprised them both. She waded over, scooped the animal up with one arm, and set it on drier ground. Elias felt that laugh vibrate in his own ribs. It terrified him. It was a domestic sound, a human sound, a sound that suggested a future where he might not be alone. And because it terrified him, he turned away sharply, picking up the box of nails. "We have a mile of wire to check before dark," he said, his voice rougher than necessary. "Let us move." Greta's smile faded, but she nodded. She was used to his retreats. She picked up the heavy spool of barbed wire as if it were a spool of thread and followed him. 3 days later, the mud had hardened enough to move stock. They needed to drive a small herd of 30 heifers to the upper grazing lands, where the grass was already greening in the sun. The route took them through a narrow throat of the valley, a canyon walled in by tumbled boulders and scrub oak. The cattle were skittish, spooked by the shadows and the wind that funneled through the gap. Elias rode the bay, whistling sharply to keep the stragglers in line. Greta rode a massive roan gelding Elias had traded for in town, the only horse strong enough to carry her comfortably all day. She rode well, her long legs gripping the horse's barrel, her balance sure. They were nearing the exit of the canyon when 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them. They sat silhouetted against the bright sky for a moment, then spurred their horses down the scree slope, sliding and scrambling until they blocked the trail. Elias pulled the bay up. He recognized the lead rider immediately. It was Cobb, the foreman for the Hale Ranch. Hale was a man who believed the entire territory belonged to him by divine right, and Cobb was the fist he used to enforce that belief. Cobb was a thick-necked man with a face like a clenched fist, wearing a duster coat that cost more than Elias's saddle. "You are lost." "Thorn," Cobb said, letting his horse dance sideways. "This range belongs to Mr. Hale." Elias kept his hands visible on the pommel of his saddle. He did not reach for the rifle in his scabbard. "This is open range. Cobb, you know that, and even if it were not, my deed covers the valley floor up to the tree line." Cobb spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the dusty rock. He did not look at Elias. He looked past him, fixing his eyes on Greta. Cobb grinned, revealing yellow teeth. His 2 companions, younger men with cruel eyes, snickered. "Well now," Cobb drawled, "I heard rumors. They said you bought yourself a circus act." "Thorn, but I didn't think it was true." Greta sat motionless on the roan. She fixed her eyes on the horizon, practicing the breathing. 1, 2, 3. "That is a lot of woman," one of the younger men said, laughing. "You reckon she sleeps in the barn with the rest of the livestock?" Elias felt the blood hammer in his ears. The old rage, the red haze that had descended on him the night he killed a man, began to creep into the edges of his vision. He wanted to pull the Winchester. He wanted to knock Cobb out of the saddle and grind his face into the rocks. But he looked at the 3 men. They were heavily armed. Their hands were hovering near their pistols. If he drew, there would be a firefight. Greta was in the open. She was a massive target. He swallowed the bile in his throat. He unclenched his hands. "Let us pass." "Cobb," Elias said, his voice dead and flat. "We are just moving cattle?" Cobb laughed again. "Look at him. Boys, the big bad killer, tamed by a giantess. You must be desperate. Thorn, or maybe you just like them monstrous. Does she charge you a ticket to look at her?" Greta did not flinch, but Elias saw her knuckles turn white on the reins. "Move aside," Elias said. Cobb stared at him for a long moment, waiting for Elias to break. When Elias did not move, Cobb shrugged. "Go on then," Cobb said. "Take your freaks and your starving cows. But tell your woman to watch her head. The sky is low in these parts." The men parted, laughing as Greta rode past. She did not look at them. She kept her chin level, her face a mask of stone. Elias brought up the rear, his back prickling, expecting a shot in the back. None came, just the laughter, echoing off the canyon walls. The ride back to the ranch house was silent. The sun was hot, but the air between them was freezing. When they reached the corral and unsaddled the horses, Greta finally spoke. She was brushing the roan, her strokes hard and angry. "You should have let them speak," she said, her voice tight. Elias threw his saddle onto the rail with a violent crash. "They were looking for a fight. Greta, they were looking at me," she said. She turned to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. They were looking at the monster. "Stop it," Elias snapped. "Why? It is true." She gestured to herself, a sweeping, bitter motion. "Look at me, Elias. I am a shield. No one wants to come near the giant. You could have hidden behind me." "That is what I am good for." Elias crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He grabbed her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, bruising. "Do not say that," he hissed. "Do not ever talk about yourself like that." Greta stared at him, shocked by his intensity. "I am not blind." "Elias," she cried. "I saw your face. You were humiliated." "I was not humiliated," Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "I was afraid." The word hung in the air between them. "I was afraid they would hurt you," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was afraid I would have to kill 3 men today, and I did not want you to see that. I did not want you to see the blood." He let go of her shoulders as if they burned him. He stepped back, his chest heaving. He looked at her, at the confusion and the hurt in her eyes, and he felt a wave of shame wash over him. He cared. He cared so much it made him sick to his stomach, and he did not know how to handle it. "I have chores to do," he muttered. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkening interior of the barn, leaving her alone with the wind. The storm that night was not like the winter blizzards. It was a spring storm, violent and electrical. The clouds boiled over the mountains in ink-black towers, lit from within by spasms of lightning. The thunder did not roll. It cracked like a whip, shaking the dust from the cabin ceiling. Greta sat by the fire, mending a shirt. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. He had not spoken since the argument in the corral. The tension in the room was thicker than the air outside. The rain began, hitting the roof like handfuls of gravel. Then, the wind picked up, screaming around the corners of the logs. Suddenly, a sound sharper than the thunder cut through the noise. Crack! The window above the wash basin shattered. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floor. Elias was on the floor instantly, rolling toward the door, his rifle in his hand. "Get down!" He roared. Greta dropped to the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What was that? A gunshot," Elias said. He kicked the door open and peered out into the deluge. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard. "The corral!" he shouted. In the flash, they saw it. The fence rails they had repaired days ago were down. A dark figure on horseback was driving the cattle out of the pen, scattering them into the stormy darkness toward the hills. "They cut the fence," Elias yelled. "They are running the herd." He did not wait. He ran out into the rain. Greta scrambled up. She did not think. She did not consider the danger. She only knew that the cattle were their livelihood, their only hope of surviving the next winter. She grabbed her coat and ran after him. Outside, the world was chaos. The rain was blinding, coming down in sheets that drowned out all vision. The mud was slick as oil. Elias was running toward the breach in the fence, waving his arms, trying to turn the lead cows back. "Yeah, get back!" he screamed. Greta ran to the other side of the break. A terrified heifer was charging toward the open range. Greta lunged, waving her arms, her massive silhouette looming in the lightning flashes. "Turn back!" she shouted. She managed to spook the heifer. It turned, slipping in the mud, and scrambled back toward the barn. Elias was shouting something, but the wind tore the words away. He was pointing at the ridge. Another flash of lightning lit up the hill. A rider stood there. He raised a rifle. Elias saw the muzzle flash before he heard the report. "No!" Elias screamed. The bullet was not meant for him. It was meant for the livestock. Or perhaps it was just a warning shot fired blindly into the chaos. It did not matter. Greta was turning, her boots fighting for purchase in the muck. She felt something hit her. Not a sharp pain, but a massive, dull impact, like being kicked by a horse. It spun her around. She gasped, the air leaving her lungs. Her legs simply stopped working. She collapsed, hitting the mud with a heavy, wet thud. "Greta!" Elias was there in seconds. He skidded to his knees beside her, the mud soaking his trousers. He grabbed her, pulling her head into his lap. "Greta, can you hear me?" She looked up at him. The rain was washing the dirt from his face. He looked terrified. She tried to speak, but her mouth tasted of copper. She put a hand to her side, just above her hip. It came away warm and black in the darkness. I fell," she whispered. "No," Elias said, his voice strangling. "No, you did not fall." He looked at her side. The fabric of her dress was torn and dark. Blood was pulsing out, mixing with the rain and the mud. He looked up at the ridge. The rider was gone. The cattle were scattered. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the woman bleeding into the earth. "We have to get inside," Elias said. He tried to lift her. She was heavy, dead weight in her shock. He gritted his teeth, the cords in his neck standing out. He hooked his arms under her shoulders. "Help me, Greta," he begged. "Push." She tried. She dug her heels into the slime. Together, they scrambled and dragged their way across the yard. The rain lashed at them, trying to beat them down. Elias pulled her up the steps, kicking the door open, and dragged her onto the rug in front of the hearth. He slammed the door and barred it. The sudden silence of the room was deafening. He knelt beside her. He took his knife and cut the sodden wool of her dress, ripping it away to expose the wound. It was an ugly hole, puckered and dark, just below her ribs. It was not bleeding in a fast spurt, but in a steady, ominous flow. Elias felt the room spin. For a second, he was back in the canyon. 10 years ago, he saw Samuel's broken body. He heard the scream. "Don't freeze!" he commanded himself. "Do not freeze!" He grabbed a towel from the basin and pressed it against the wound. "Hold this," he ordered. "Press hard." Greta obeyed, her hands shaking. She was cold, so cold. Elias threw logs onto the fire. He poured water into a pan and set it on the coals. He found his whiskey bottle and poured a generous amount over his hunting knife. Then he held the blade into the flames. Greta watched him. Her vision was tunneling. She saw the knife blade turn black, then glow a dull, menacing red. What are you doing?" she breathed. "The bullet is still in there." Elias said. He did not look at her. He was staring at the knife. "If I leave it, the fever will take you. Or the poison." He turned to her. His face was gray, sweat beading on his forehead. "I have to get it out." Greta's eyes widened. Panic, sharp and primal. Cut through the shock. "No," she whimpered. "No cutting. I have no choice," Elias said. His voice was shaking, but his hands were steadying as he gripped the handle. He moved the towel. He poured whiskey over the wound. Greta screamed. A raw, guttural sound that tore at Elias's heart. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am sorry." He touched the tip of the knife to her skin. He had to probe. He had to find the lead. He pushed the blade in. Greta thrashed. Her legs kicked out, knocking over a chair. "You are hurting me! Hold still!" Elias shouted, terrified that he would nick an artery. "I need you to hold still." He dug deeper. The knife scraped against something. Gristle. Muscle. He couldn't find the metal. Greta gasped, her back arching off the floor. "You're going too deep." The word slammed into her mind. Unlocking a cellar door she kept chained shut. She was back in her father's house. She was back in the doctor's office in Chicago after the miscarriage, where the physician had been rough and impatient, treating her large body like a side of beef, muttering about her unnatural proportions. She remembered the feeling of being invaded, of being handled without care, of being meat. "Please," she sobbed. "Stop! You are going too deep." Elias looked at her face. He saw the terror there, not just of the pain, but of the violation. He saw the child inside the giant woman, cowering in the dark. He wanted to stop. He wanted to throw the knife away and hold her. But if he stopped, she died. "I have to," he said, his voice cracking. "I need to reach the bullet. Greta, or the wound will never heal." He wasn't talking about the lead anymore. He was talking about the poison in both of them. The silence, the shame, the belief that they were broken things that deserved to be hurt. He pressed down. He felt the grate of steel on lead. There it is. He gritted out. He twisted the knife. Greta let out a high, keen moan and went limp, fainting from the pain. Elias worked fast then. He levered the bullet out. It fell onto the floorboards with a heavy clink, a misshapen lump of gray death. He grabbed the needle and thread he had prepared. He sewed the wound shut, his hands slick with her blood. He bandaged her tight with strips of clean linen. Only when it was done did he collapse. He sat back on his heels, his breath coming in jagged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were covered in red. He looked at Greta. She was pale, her breathing shallow but steady. She was alive. The storm raged outside, pounding against the walls, but Elias did not hear it. He only heard the beat of her heart. The night was a long, fevered vigil. Elias moved the mattress from the bedroom to the front of the fire, lifting Greta as gently as if she were made of glass. He covered her with every quilt they owned. She burned with fever. She tossed and turned, muttering in her native tongue, calling out for her mother, begging someone to stop laughing. Elias sat in the wooden chair beside her. He dipped a rag in cool water and wiped her forehead. He wiped her massive, strong neck. He wiped her hands, those hands that could split wood and carry calves, now limp and helpless. He took her hand in his own hand engulfed hers, but just barely. "I will not let you go," he whispered to the sleeping woman. He thought of Samuel. He thought of the moment the herd had turned, the moment he had frozen. He had watched his brother die because he was afraid to act. Tonight, he had acted. He had cut her. He had hurt her to save her. "I will not let you die like him," Elias said into the dark. "I am not that man anymore. Because of you." He held her hand until his fingers went numb. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, counting the breaths just as she did. 1, 2, 3. The storm blew itself out before dawn. The wind died, leaving a silence so profound it rang in the ears. Greta woke slowly. The pain in her side was a dull, throbbing fire, but the sharp agony was gone. She opened her eyes. The room was bathed in the cold, golden light of morning. The fire had burned down to embers. She turned her head. Elias was asleep in the chair. His head was bowed on his chest, his arms hanging loose. He looked wrecked. His shirt was stained with her blood. His face was gray with exhaustion, but his hand was still wrapped around hers. Greta looked at their joined hands. She looked at the man who had terrified her the night before, the man who had cut her open. She realized then what he had done. He had not done it to hurt her. He had done it because the alternative, losing her, was unbearable to him. She remembered the look on his face when she was lying in the mud. It was the same look she had seen in the mirror all her life. Fear, but not fear of her. Fear for her. He had fought for her. He had dug into the darkness and pulled her back. Greta squeezed his hand. It was a weak pressure, barely a flutter. Elias jerked awake instantly. His eyes flew open, wild and panicked, until they found hers. "Greta?" he croaked. "I am here," she whispered. Elias slumped, the tension leaving his body in a great, shuddering sigh. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his forehead. closing his eyes. "You are here," he repeated. Greta looked past him, out the shattered window where the morning sun was turning the muddy yard into a field of gold. The ranch was damaged. The cattle were gone. They had enemies who wanted to destroy them. But as she looked at Elias, bowing his head over her hand as if in prayer, she knew one thing for certain. They were not alone anymore. And the wound, deep as it was, had begun to heal. The weeks that followed the storm were a slow, grinding passage of time, measured not in hours but in the changing angle of the sunlight across the cabin floorboards. The world outside, indifferent to the violence that had unfolded within the cabin walls, began its relentless march toward summer. The snow retreated to the highest crags of the granite peaks, leaving behind a valley floor that exploded into a riot of green. Wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and larkspur pushed up through the soil where the mud had been, turning the pasture into a waving sea of color. For Greta, this beauty was a torment. She was confined to the bed in the corner of the room, trapped by the healing wound in her side and the fever that came and went like a tide. She lay on the mattress, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of the remaining cattle, the ring of a hammer on iron, the wind sighing through the pines. She hated the bed. She hated the weakness that made her limbs feel heavy and useless. For her entire life, her body had been her only currency. It was too big to be beautiful, too imposing to be feminine, but it had been useful. It could carry, lift, and endure. Now, lying under the heavy quilts, she felt like a great, beached ship, rotting on the shore while the ocean moved without her. "I am a burden," she thought, watching dust motes dance in a shaft of light. "I am a mouth to feed that does no work." Elias was a ghost in his own house. He was up before the sun, his boots scuffing softly on the floor as he stoked the fire, and he did not return until long after dark. He was doing the work of 3 men. He repaired the fences alone, dragging the heavy rails into place with a grim, silent determination. He rode the range to gather the scattered herd, pushing himself and the bay horse to the point of collapse. And yet, he never complained, not once. Whenever he came inside, he washed his hands in the basin, scrubbing away the dirt and blood of the day until his skin was red and raw. Then, he would come to her. He changed her bandages with hands that shook from exhaustion but remained impossibly gentle. He cooked broth from the venison jerky and spooned it into her mouth when she was too weak to sit up. He emptied the chamber pot without a word of disgust, maintaining a quiet dignity that stripped the shame from the act. One evening, 3 weeks after the shooting, Elias sat in the wooden chair beside the bed. He looked thinner. The lines around his eyes were etched deeper, filled with the dust of the high country. He held a bowl of stew, blowing on a spoonful to cool it. "You look like death." "Elias," Greta said. Her voice was stronger now, though it still rasped in her chest. Elias offered her the spoon. "I have looked worse. Eat. You cannot keep doing this," she said, pushing the spoon away gently. "You are killing yourself. You should hire a man from town. I have no money for a man," Elias said simply, "and I do not trust them." He forced the spoon into her hand. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, like sandpaper, but warm. "I am useless to you like this?" Greta murmured, staring into the dark broth. "A giant invalid. You must regret the day you stepped off that boardwalk." Elias set the bowl down on the small table. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped loosely. "Do not say that," he said. "It is true. You wanted a partner. You got a patient." Elias looked at her. The firelight cast deep shadows across his face, hiding his eyes. But his voice was clear. "I did not want a partner. Greta, I did not know what I wanted, but I know what I have found." He reached out and adjusted the quilt over her feet. "You saved the calf." He said, "You walked through a blizzard. You stood in front of Hale's men. There is nothing useless about you. You are just healing. Iron has to get hot before it can be shaped." Greta looked at him, surprised by the poetry in his rough voice. The intimacy of the room, the small circle of firelight pushing back the vast, dark night outside, loosened something in her chest. "My father," she began, her voice low. "He did not think I was iron. He thought I was a commodity." Elias went still. "Tell me, when I was 16, Greta said, staring at the ceiling. "A man came to our village. He ran a traveling show. He had a bearded lady. He had a man with scales like a fish. He saw me carrying 2 pails of milk, towering over the other girls. He offered my father $50 for me." Elias made a sound in his throat, a sharp intake of breath. $50, Greta repeated. "It was a fortune. My father, he considered it. He told my mother that I would never find a husband, that I was too big to be loved, so I might as well be paid to be looked at." She turned her head on the pillow to look at Elias. My mother stopped him. She threatened to burn the house down with him in it, but I never forgot the look in his eyes. He was calculating my weight. He was counting the tickets he could sell. Elias reached out and took her hand. His grip was tight, almost painful. "That is why I came here," Greta whispered. "To be somewhere where no one knew that story. But I carried it with me. And then there was a man in Chicago, before Silas Vane." Elias did not speak. He just held her hand, anchoring her. "I was engaged," she said. "He was a dock worker, big, like me. I thought we matched. I thought he would understand, but he did not want a wife. He wanted something he could conquer. He treated my body like it was lumber, like it had no feeling because there was so much of it." She closed her eyes, a tear leaking out to track through the dust on her cheek. "I was with child. And he was rough. He said a woman my size could take it. I lost the baby. I lost it, Elias. And he was angry because I was too weak to carry his son." The silence in the cabin was heavy, thick with the ghosts of her pain. Elias bowed his head, pressing her hand against his forehead. "I am sorry," he rasped. "I am so sorry." He stayed like that for a long time. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were wet. "I have ghosts too, Greta, I know," she said. "Your brother." Elias nodded. He looked into the fire, watching the flames consume a log. "His name was Samuel. He was 6 years younger than me. Small, quick to laugh. He was everything I was not." Elias took a breath, a shuddering sound. "We were moving a herd across the Red River. It was storming. Thunder shook the ground. The cattle spooked. 3,000 head, blind with panic. They turned back on us. He swallowed hard. I saw Samuel's horse go down. He was thrown. He was standing there, in the mud, waving his hat. The herd was coming right at him. I was on the ridge. I had a clear path. I could have ridden down. I could have cut them off, or at least pulled him up behind me." Greta squeezed his hand. "But I froze," Elias whispered. "The noise, it was like the end of the world. I felt the fear seize my legs. I could not move. I just watched. I watched the led steer hit him. I watched him disappear under the hooves. I heard him scream my name." He looked at Greta, his face a mask of agony. "I let him die because I was a coward, and I have been trying to outrun that moment for 10 years. I work until I cannot stand because if I stop, I hear him." Greta reached up and touched his face. Her fingers traced the scar on his cheek. "You are not a coward. Elias, you froze. You are human. I am a man who let his brother die," he insisted bitterly. "And you are a man who cut into me to save my life," Greta said fiercely. "You were terrified. I saw it in your eyes. But you did not freeze. You acted. You are not that man on the ridge anymore." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and the walls they had built around themselves began to crumble. He saw a woman who hid her vulnerability behind her size, using her strength as a shield to keep people from seeing how easily she could be hurt. She saw a man who hid his softness behind silence, working himself to death to pay a debt that could never be settled. They were two broken things, trying to hold each other together. Elias leaned down. He kissed her forehead. It was a chaste kiss, but it burned with a tenderness that made Greta's breath catch. "Rest now," he said softly. "We are both safe here. Summer arrived in earnest, turning the high grass gold. Greta's strength returned slowly. First, she could sit in the chair by the fire. Then, she could walk to the porch. Finally, she could walk to the barn. The wound left a jagged, ugly scar on her side, a knot of pink tissue that pulled when she twisted. But she was alive. When she was strong enough to ride in the wagon, they knew they could not avoid the town forever. They needed supplies, flour, coffee, nails. They rode into Blackwood on a Saturday morning. The air was hot and still. As the wagon rattled down the main street, Greta felt the change immediately. It was not the mocking laughter of her arrival. It was something colder. Conversations stopped as they passed. Men standing on the boardwalk turned their backs. Women pulled their children closer, whispering behind their hands. Greta sat upright on the wagon bench, her chin high, but her stomach churned. "What is it?" she whispered to Elias. "Why do they look at us like that?" Elias flicked the reins, his face grim. "Ignore them." He pulled the wagon up to the general store, not Silas Vane's shop, but the dry goods merchant at the other end of town. Elias jumped down and helped Greta descend. She moved stiffly, favoring her left side. As they walked toward the door, a group of ranch hands from the Hale outfit were lounging on the steps. They did not move to let them pass. "Well, look at that," one of them drawled. "It walks." "We heard you were dead," another sneered. "Heard old Elias finally snapped and put a bullet in the beast." Elias stopped. His hand twitched toward his hip, but he was not wearing a gun belt. He had left it at the ranch, trying to avoid trouble. "Move aside," Elias said. The men laughed. "They say he shot you." "Giant," the first man said to Greta. "Said he got drunk and tried to carve you down to size. Is that true? Or did he just use you for target practice to scare off the neighbors?" "It is a lie," Greta said, her voice shaking with rage. "It was one of your own who shot me." The man spat on the ground near her boot. "That ain't the story we heard. We heard you two are unnatural, that he keeps you up there like a pet monster. Maybe he shot you to keep you from eating him out of house and home." Elias lunged. He grabbed the man by the collar of his duster and slammed him against the wall of the store. The wood groaned. "Say another word," Elias snarled, his face inches from the man's. "And I will bury you where you stand." The other hand stood up, hands dropping to their knives. "Elias, no!" Greta grabbed his arm. Her grip was strong. Even in her weakened state, she pulled him back. "They want you to fight. Do not give them the satisfaction." Elias held the man's gaze for a second longer, breathing hard, then released him with a shove. He turned and steered Greta into the store. Inside, it was cool and dim, but the atmosphere was no better. The shopkeeper served them in silence, slapping the sacks of flour onto the counter with unnecessary force. When they walked back out, loaded with supplies, Mrs. Galloway, the preacher's wife, was waiting by the wagon. She was a small, bird-like woman with eyes like polished obsidian. She stepped in front of Greta. She did not look up at Greta's face. She looked at her stomach, then her hands. "It is a shame." "Mrs." Galloway said. Her voice was low, a hiss meant only for them. "What is a shame?" Greta asked, clutching a sack of coffee against her chest. "That you survived, Mrs." Galloway said. Greta recoiled as if she had been slapped. "The Lord tries to correct mistakes." "Mrs." Galloway continued, her face pinched with self-righteous malice. "Some unions just aren't natural. A woman of your nature, and a man with his bloodlust, it is an abomination. You are bringing a darkness on this valley." Elias dropped the sack of flour into the wagon bed with a heavy thud. "Get out of my way, Mrs. Galloway," Elias said. "Before I forget you are a woman of the cloth." "Mrs." Galloway sniffed, clutching her shawl. "You can threaten me, Mr. Thorne, but you cannot fight the will of God. That woman is a curse." She turned and walked away, her head high. Greta stood frozen by the wagon. The words cut deeper than the bullet had. "Abomination, curse, mistake, get in the wagon," Elias said gently. They rode out of town in silence. The dust tasted of ash. Greta looked at the mountains, but they no longer looked like a fortress. They looked like the walls of a prison. That evening, the cabin felt too small. The air was thick with the unsaid things that had piled up during the ride home. Elias was pacing the floor. He was angry. Angry at the town. Angry at Hale. Angry at his own helplessness. He kicked a log back into the fire, sending sparks flying. "They are going to come back," he said. "Hale will not stop with rumors. He wants the water rights. He will use this story about me shooting you to turn the law against us." Greta sat at the table, staring at her hands. "I am the cause," she said quietly. Elias stopped pacing. "What? If I were not here, they would not have these stories. They hate me, Elias. They hate that I am big. They hate that I am foreign. And they hate you because you are with me. That is nonsense," Elias snapped. "They hate me because I have the water. You are just the excuse. I am the target." Greta cried, standing up. The chair scraped loudly on the floor. "Mrs. Galloway was right. I am a curse. Everywhere I go, people laugh, they stare. And now they are hurting you." Elias ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling over. He was exhausted. His leg ached. He was terrified of losing the ranch, terrified of losing her. "I do not care what they say," he shouted. "You should care," Greta shouted back. "You cannot live like this, fighting everyone, being an outcast. I have been an outcast my whole life, but not like this." Greta stepped toward him. "Before, they feared you. Now, they mock you. Because of me, because you married the freak." "Stop it," Elias roared. He slammed his hand onto the table. The wood cracked. "I am tired. Greta, I am tired of the work. I am tired of the lies. I am tired of watching the horizon for dust." He looked at her, his eyes wild and desperate. "I can't fight the whole world," he yelled. The words hung in the air, vibrating in the sudden silence. Greta felt her heart stop. She looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his slump. She heard the defeat in his voice. "I can't fight the whole world." She heard what her fear told her to hear. "I can't fight the world for you. It is too much. You are too heavy a burden." She took a step back. Her face went slack. "I understand," she whispered. Elias rubbed his face with his hands. He did not see the look in her eyes. He thought she understood that he was just venting, that he was just scared. "I am going to check the horses," he muttered. "I need air." He walked out of the cabin, letting the door slam shut behind him. Greta stood alone in the center of the room. The fire popped. "He cannot fight the whole world," she said to the empty room. "And I am the reason the world is fighting him." The logic was simple. It was brutal. It was the logic of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much, too big, too loud, too heavy. She knew what she had to do. She had to make herself small. She had to disappear. She moved quietly, like a sleepwalker. She went to the bedroom. She found her old carpet bag. She did not pack much. A change of clothes, the loaf of bread from the pantry, a small tin of matches. She took off the plain gold band Elias had placed on her finger in the church. She looked at it for a long moment. It was the only beautiful thing she had ever owned. She placed it on the table, next to the oil lamp. She sat in the chair by the window and waited. She waited until Elias came back in, until he undressed in the dark and collapsed onto the bed. She waited until his breathing evened out into the deep, rhythmic sleep of the exhausted. Then she stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up the bag. She looked at him one last time. He was sleeping on his side, his arm thrown out across the empty space where she should be. "I love you," she whispered. The words were so soft they did not stir the dust. "That is why I am leaving." She opened the door. The hinges were well oiled. Elias had fixed them. There was no sound. She stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. The valley was a bowl of blue-gray light. The stars were fading, and the eastern sky was bleaching into a pale, sickly yellow. The air was cold, biting at her healing wound. But she ignored it. She did not take a horse. That would be theft. She walked. She walked past the barn, past the corral where the horses were dozing. She walked past the garden patch she had started to turn. She walked out onto the open track that led south, toward the railroad line. 30 miles away. The silence was absolute. Behind her, the pine trees swayed gently, nodding their dark heads. High above, a hawk circled in the rising thermal, a lonely witness to the woman walking away from the only home she had ever known. Elias woke with a start. He did not know what woke him. It was not a sound. It was an absence. He reached out his hand. The sheets beside him were cold. "Greta," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Silence. He sat up, blinking against the morning light streaming through the window. The cabin was empty. The fire was dead ash. "Greta!" He threw off the covers and scrambled out of bed. He ran to the main room. She was not there. He saw the carpet bag was gone from the corner. He saw the empty spot in the pantry where the bread had been. Then he saw the glint of gold on the table. He walked over to it. He picked up the ring. It was small in his calloused palm. Cold, abandoned. Panic hit him like a physical blow to the gut. It doubled him over. He couldn't breathe. The room was shrinking. No, 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 no. It was the canyon all over again. It was Samuel screaming his name. It was the feeling of being too late, of standing frozen while the thing he loved was destroyed. "I can't fight the whole world." He remembered the words he had shouted. He remembered the look on her face, the sudden stillness, the withdrawal. "She thought I meant her," he realized with a sickening jolt. "She thought I was giving up on her." He ran to the door and threw it open. "Greta!" he screamed. His voice tore at his throat, echoing off the distant cliffs. There was no answer. Only the wind. He looked at the ground. The mud from the spring rains had dried into a crust, but it was still soft enough to hold a mark. He saw them, her footprints, large, deep impressions in the earth, heading south, walking. She was walking, with a bullet wound that was barely healed. She would die out there. Hale's men were patrolling. The coyotes were hungry. The land did not forgive mistakes. Elias did not bother to saddle the bay. He grabbed a bridle from the porch rail and ran to the pasture. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. The horse lifted its head and trotted over. Elias vaulted onto the horse's bare back, gripping the mane. He spun the animal around. He looked at the tracks stretching out toward the horizon. "I will not freeze," he snarled through his teeth. "Not this time." He kicked the horse into a gallop, thundering out of the yard, chasing the ghost of the woman who had tried to save him by breaking his heart. Greta walked until the sun was high and white above her, a blinding eye that stared down without pity. The land here was a labyrinth of scrub oak and shattered granite, a place where the earth seemed to have been broken by a giant hammer and left to rot. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. Her boots, worn thin by the months of ranch work, slipped on the scree, sending cascades of small stones rattling down into the dry washes below. The pain in her side was a dull, rhythmic throb, waking up with every jarring step, but she welcomed it. It was a clean pain. It was a physical reminder that she was alive, unlike the twisting, suffocating shame that had driven her from the cabin. She reached a stream that cut through a fissure in the rock, the water running fast and gray with snowmelt. She knelt to drink, seeing her reflection broken by the ripples. Her hair was loose, matted with dust. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp as flint. "I am a ghost," she thought, scooping the freezing water to her lips. "I am a giant ghost haunting a land that does not want me." She crossed the stream, the water numbing her legs up to her knees, and climbed the far bank. The solitude was absolute. There was no sound but the wind hissing through the sagebrush and the croak of a raven circling overhead. For a moment, standing on a ridge with the wind whipping her coat around her legs, she felt a sudden, terrifying expansion in her chest. She was free. There were no eyes here, no whispers, no one to measure her, to judge the width of her shoulders or the length of her stride. She was just another creature moving through the wild, no more significant than the elk or the bear. But as the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the canyon floor, the freedom curdled into a deep, hollow ache. She was alone. She had left the only person who had ever looked at her and seen a woman instead of a curiosity. She remembered Elias sleeping. his arm thrown out to the empty space where she had been. "I did it for him," she whispered to the rocks. "I did it to save him." She was descending toward a narrow box canyon, looking for a place to bed down out of the wind, when the world exploded into noise. Horses burst from the cover of a cedar thicket. Ropes whistled through the air. Greta turned, her instincts screaming, but she was too slow. A lariat settled over her shoulders and jerked tight, pinning her arms to her sides. She stumbled, fighting for balance, her boots sliding in the loose gravel. Another rope caught her ankle. She went down hard, the breath driven from her lungs in a grunt of pain. She thrashed, kicking out with a power that surprised the riders. One horse shied violently, nearly unseating its rider. "Hold her!" a voice shouted. "She's strong as a damn ox!" Greta looked up through a haze of dust. 3 men circled her. She recognized the dusters. She recognized the cruelty in their faces. They were Hale's men, the same men who had mocked her on the trail. "Get off me!" she roared, struggling to rise, dragging the man holding the shoulder rope forward in his saddle. One of the men jumped down and ran at her. She tried to roll, to use her legs, but a boot slammed into her ribs, the injured side. The world went white. She gasped, curling in on herself as agony knifed through her. Rough hands grabbed her wrists. They bound her with rawhide, pulling the knots tight enough to bite into the skin. They hauled her up, treating her not like a person, but like a captured bear. "Well now," the lead rider said, spitting tobacco onto the ground near her face. "Look what we found wandering off the range. The boss will be very interested to see this." They did not take her back to town. They dragged her, forcing her to walk behind the horses at a stumbling pace that left her gasping for air, to an abandoned line shack nestled in the throat of the canyon. It was a rotting carcass of a building, the roof sagging, the door hanging on leather hinges. They shoved her inside. The air smelled of rat droppings and ancient mold. They pushed her into a heavy wooden chair and lashed her to it, winding the rope around her chest and the chair back, trapping her arms. Greta sat there, her chest heaving, her hair falling over her face. She glared at them. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice rasping. The men laughed. They broke out a bottle of whiskey and sat on crates, staring at her with a mixture of wariness and ugly excitement. "We want your man to sign a paper," the leader said. "A simple deed transfer. He loves his land, but I reckon he might trade it to get his pet monster back. Or maybe not," the younger one snickered, taking a swig of the bottle. "Maybe he'll thank us. And then we can take her on the road." Greta went still. "I bet people in Denver would pay a silver dollar to see the Amazon bride," the man continued, his eyes crawling over her. "We could put her in a cage, make her lift heavy rocks, dress her up in a little tiny dress. It would be a spectacle. Boys, a real gold mine." The words tore through Greta's defenses like bullets. It was her nightmare made flesh. The circus, the cage, the reduction of her humanity to a sum of pounds and inches. The rage that rose in her was not hot. It was cold and hard, a glacier moving through her veins. "I am not a spectacle," she said, her voice low and dangerous. The men ignored her, passing the bottle, already spending the money they imagined she would earn them. Greta gripped the arms of the chair. She tested the ropes. They were tight, but the wood of the chair was old, dry. She closed her eyes. 1, 2, 3. She began to pull. Elias found the place where she had fallen. It was not hard to track. The scuff marks in the gravel were violent and deep. He dismounted, his movements jerky with suppressed panic. He knelt and touched the earth. He found a scrap of gray wool caught on a mesquite bush. It was from her coat. He found the boot prints of 3 horses. He knew the shoeing pattern. The blacksmith in town had a distinctive way of turning the heel calks. These belonged to the Hale outfit. Elias stood up. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes. He looked toward the canyon, then toward the town. If he rode to the canyon alone, he might get killed, and Greta would be left at their mercy. If he rode to town, he lost time. He thought of Samuel. He thought of the moment of hesitation that had cost a life. "I will not freeze." He swung back onto the bay horse. He turned its head toward Blackwood. He needed witnesses. He needed the law. Even if the law was weak, he needed to burn Hale's legitimacy to the ground so that when he killed him, it would stay finished. He rode the horse hard, its hooves drumming a frantic rhythm on the hard-packed road. He reached Blackwood as the sun was touching the western horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. He rode straight to the sheriff's office and kicked the door open. Sheriff Miller was eating a plate of beans, his feet up on the desk. He jumped, his hand going to his gun, then relaxing when he saw Elias. "Thorne? What in the hell?" Hale's men took her. Elias said. He did not shout. His voice was a quiet, terrifying vibration. "Who?" "Greta, my wife. They ambushed her near the canyon. I found the sign." Miller wiped his mouth with a napkin, looking uncomfortable. "Now." "Elias, that's a heavy accusation. Maybe she just left. People talk. They say you two were having trouble." "She left," Elias said, "and then they took her. They are holding her, probably at the old line shack in the canyon. It is the only cover out there." Miller sighed, shifting in his chair. "Look, Hale is a powerful man. I can't just go kicking down doors on a hunch. It's a domestic dispute." "Likely." Elias walked to the desk. He placed his hands on the wood and leaned down. Miller shrank back. "It is kidnapping," Elias said, "and if you do not ride with me, I will go alone, and I will kill every man I find there. And when the circuit judge comes through, I will tell him you sat here eating beans while a woman was held prisoner." Miller swallowed hard. "I am going," Elias said. "Who is coming with me?" He turned and walked out into the street. He stood in the center of the dust, his chest heaving. "I need help," he shouted. A few people stopped. They looked at the wild-eyed rancher, the man they had whispered about for years. "Hale's men have taken my wife," Elias yelled. "They have taken Greta." Most turned away. They feared Hale more than they pitied Elias. But then, the door to the boarding house opened. Mrs. Parsons stepped out. She was a plain woman, worn down by children and work. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked into the street. "I will ride with you." "Elias," she said. Elias looked at her, blinking. "You?" "She came to my house in the winter." "Mrs. Parsons said, her voice carrying in the silence. "When my little girl was sick with the croup. She brought milk. She split wood for my stove because my husband was away. She is a good woman, and I will not see her treated like an animal." She looked around at the men on the boardwalk. "Shame on you," she snapped. "All of you. Afraid of a bully like Hale. A young man, a drifter who had been working at the livery stable." Stepped forward. He spat on the ground. "I never liked Hale much anyway. He cheated me on a horse trade. I'll come." Then another, an older ranch hand who had known Elias's father. Sheriff Miller appeared in the doorway, putting on his hat. He looked defeated. All right. No need to start a civil war. I'm coming." They rode out 10 minutes later. It was a motley posse. Elias, the sheriff, Mrs. Parsons riding a mule with a Winchester across her lap, and 3 hands. The sky was darkening rapidly. The wind had teeth. Elias rode at the front, his eyes fixed on the black mouth of the canyon in the distance. Every hoofbeat felt like a countdown. Tick, tick, tick. He prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. "Keep her safe. Give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes." Inside the shack, the light was failing. The men had lit a kerosene lantern, casting long, jumping shadows against the rotting logs. Greta's wrists were bleeding. The rawhide had cut deep, but she did not stop. She twisted her arms, slicking the rope with her own blood. The men were getting bored. The novelty of their captive was wearing off, replaced by the gnawing hunger of men who had been waiting too long. "Where is Hale?" one of them grumbled. "He said he'd be here by sundown." "He's coming," the leader said. "He wants to make an entrance, wants to see Thorne crawl." He looked at Greta. "You better hope your husband loves you. Giant. Otherwise, you're going to be seeing a lot of the country from the inside of a cage." Greta stared at him. The rage had condensed into a singular point of focus. She felt the wood of the chair back give slightly. A crack. She took a breath. She expanded her chest, straining against the ropes that bound her torso. She pushed backward with her legs, driving her weight against the weakened timber. Crack! The top rail of the chair snapped. The men jumped up. "Hey!" Greta roared. It was a sound that came from the bottom of her lungs, a release of weeks of silence, years of shame. She surged upward. The ropes around her chest held, but the chair disintegrated under her power. She stood up, the remains of the wooden frame still lashed to her back, her arms bound but her legs free. She looked like a vengeful spirit rising from the earth. The leader drew his pistol. "Sit down, you freak!" Greta did not sit. She charged. She slammed into the leader with her shoulder. He flew backward as if hit by a carriage, crashing into the table. The lantern wobbled but didn't fall. The pistol skittered across the floor. The other two men lunged at her. One grabbed her hair. The other struck her across the face with the back of his hand. The blow split her lip. Blood filled her mouth, but she did not fall. She stomped on the man's instep, hearing the crunch of small bones. He screamed and let go. She was fighting with a ferocity they had not expected. She was not fighting like a lady. She was fighting like a storm. The leader scrambled up, blood running from his nose. "Get her down!" He screamed. He raised his hand, holding a heavy piece of firewood he had grabbed from the pile. He raised it to strike her head. The door exploded inward. It did not open. It shattered off its hinges. Elias Thorne came through the splintering wood like a cannonball. He did not pause to assess the room. He saw the man with the wood raised over Greta. Elias hit him. He drove his shoulder into the man's gut, tackling him into the wall. The impact shook the shack. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Behind Elias, the posse poured in. The sheriff, shouting orders no one heard. Mrs. Parsons, leveling her rifle. The ranch hands. The shack became a chaotic swirl of violence. It was close, brutal work. There was no room for gunplay. It was fists and boots. Elias punched the leader in the face, feeling the nose break under his knuckles. The man went down, but Elias didn't stop. He grabbed him by the collar and threw him out the open door into the dirt. One of the other men tried to draw a knife on Greta. She turned, the chair pieces still tied to her, and swung her hip, knocking him off balance. The young drifter from the livery stable stepped in and landed a solid right hook that laid the man out cold. A gunshot rang out, the sheriff firing into the ceiling to establish order. "Enough," Miller shouted. The fighting stopped. The room was heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and kerosene. Elias turned to Greta. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. "Greta," he gasped. He reached for his knife to cut her bonds. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the hilt. He saw the blood on her wrists. He saw the split lip. "I'm all right," she said, her voice trembling. Before he could cut the first rope, a voice boomed from the darkness outside. "Thorne!" Elias froze. He knew that voice. He turned and walked to the door. Greta, still bound, shuffled after him. Hale sat on a large black stallion in the center of the clearing. He was surrounded by 4 more riders. The wind whipped his duster around him. He looked like a king inspecting a peasant uprising. "This is my land." "Thorne!" Hale shouted. "And that woman is trespassing." Elias stepped out onto the porch. The wind tore at his clothes. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The fear was gone. The ghosts were gone. There was only this moment. "The land is not yours." "Hale," Elias said. "And the woman is my wife," Hale sneered. "Your wife? That thing. She's a circus animal." "Thorne. You know it. I know it. Sign the deed, and I'll let you keep her. Refuse, and I'll burn you out." Elias stepped down into the dirt. He walked until he was 10 paces from Hale's horse. "Get off the horse." "Hale." Hale laughed. "You think you're in a position to give orders? I have 5 men here. And I have the sheriff," Elias said, pointing to Miller, who had stepped onto the porch with his shotgun, "and witnesses." Hale looked at the posse. His face darkened. "Miller, you stay out of this. This is private business. It's kidnapping." "Hale," Miller said, his voice finding a surprising firmness. "And assault. You best step down." Hale's face twisted in fury. He was a man who had never been told no. He looked at Elias, standing there in the dust, defiant. He looked at Greta, standing in the doorway, a giantess in torn clothes, unbroken. "It's mine!" Hale screamed. He went for his gun. It was a foolish, desperate move. He wasn't a gunman. He was a bully. He drew the pearl-handled revolver from his holster. Elias didn't have a gun. He lunged for the horse's bridle. The horse reared, spooked by Elias's movement and Hale's sudden shout. Hale grappled with the reins with one hand and the gun with the other. Elias grabbed Hale's leg and yanked. Hale fell from the saddle. As he hit the ground, his finger jerked on the trigger. Bang! The shot was muffled, directed inward. Hale landed hard in the dust. He groaned once, tried to sit up, and then collapsed back. A dark stain began to spread across his stomach. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind seemed to die. Hale's men on the horses looked at each other. They looked at the sheriff's shotgun. They looked at their boss, bleeding out in the dirt. "It's over," Miller shouted. "Drop 'em!" One by one, the men dropped their guns. It was done. The tyranny of the valley had ended not with a grand duel, but with a clumsy, angry mistake. Elias did not look at Hale. He turned back to the shack. He walked up the steps to Greta. He took his knife and sliced the ropes. The wood of the chair clattered to the floor. The ropes fell away from her wrists. Greta stood there, rubbing her bleeding arms. She was shaking. Her whole body hummed with the aftershock of the violence. Elias sheathed his knife. He held up his hands, as if afraid to touch her, as if she were something holy that he had nearly allowed to be destroyed. "Greta," he whispered. She looked at him. She saw the dust in his lines, the blood on his knuckles. She saw the man who had ridden into hell for her. "Elias," she said. He reached out and took her hands. His grip was gentle, barely there. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry." Greta shook her head. "No, you came. Sheriff Miller and the others were dealing with the prisoners. No one was looking at them." "Come," Elias said. He led her away from the shack, away from the body in the dirt, away from the noise. They walked into the darkness, toward a small, sheltered hollow near the canyon wall where the wind could not reach them. The sky was pricked with stars, cold and distant and beautiful. The crickets were singing, indifferent to the affairs of men. Elias stopped. He turned to her. He looked small in the moonlight, but he felt solid. "Why did you leave?" he asked. His voice was cracked. Greta looked down at her boots. "I heard you. You said you could not fight the whole world." "I was angry," Elias said. "I know, but I thought—" Greta took a breath. "I thought if I left, the world would stop fighting you. I thought I was the anchor dragging you down. I thought you would be better off without the monster." Elias stepped closer. He placed his hands on her arms, sliding them up to her shoulders. He forced her to look at him. "Listen to me," he said fiercely. "I have lived alone. I have lived with silence. I have lived with ghosts. And it was not living. It was just waiting to die." He paused, searching for the words. "When I woke up and you were gone, the cabin was not just empty. It was cold. It was the coldest place on earth." Greta's eyes filled with tears. "I cannot fight the world alone." "Greta," Elias said, "but I can fight anything if you are standing next to me." "I am too big," she whispered. "The old fear. You are just the right size," he said, to hold up the sky. He pulled her to him. It was awkward at first. Her height made it difficult for him to hold her the way a man holds a smaller woman. His arms strained to reach around her broad back. Her chin rested on the top of his head. But then he shifted. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her tight against him. She wrapped her arms around his shoulders, bowing her head to rest her cheek against his hair. They fit, like two jagged pieces of rock that had been broken from the same mountain. The hug became firm, desperate, a promise made in muscle and bone. "I love you," Elias said into her coat. Greta let out a sob that was half laugh. "I love you, Elias." They sank down onto the grass. Wrapped in the blankets Elias had brought on his saddle, they built a small fire, feeding it with dried sage. They lay side by side, watching the flames. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, tender exhaustion. Elias reached out and touched her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "Are you in pain?" he asked. Greta shook her head. "No, not anymore." She reached out and touched his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the ranch or the cattle or the town. They spoke only with their hands, with the quiet brush of fingers against skin. Elias kissed her. It was not like the kiss on her forehead. It was on her mouth. It was deep and slow and full of a hunger that had been denied for too long. Greta kissed him back. She felt the fear dissolve. She was not a spectacle here. She was not a giantess. She was a woman, lying in the arms of a man who knew the shape of her soul. The wind howled outside the hollow, but they did not hear it. They were safe in the center of their own world, letting the love they had fought for replace the shame they had carried. The return to the high country was slow. The horses were tired, and the riders were battered, their bodies mapped with the fresh bruises of the confrontation in the canyon. But as the ranch came into view, the squat cabin huddled against the wind, the leaning barn, the dark line of pines marching up the slope. It did not look like a prison anymore. It looked like a stronghold. Greta rode the roan gelding beside Elias. She sat tall in the saddle, despite the bandage bound tight around her ribs and the raw chafing on her wrists. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of two strangers trying to avoid collision. It was the companionable silence of two people who had seen the worst of each other and stayed. They rode into the yard as the sun touched the peaks, turning the lingering snow to a bruised gold. Elias dismounted and walked to her horse. He reached up, his hands spanning her waist, and helped her down. For a moment, her weight rested against him, solid, heavy, real. He did not flinch. He did not strain. He simply held her until her boots found the earth. "We are home," he said. Greta looked at the cabin. The window was still shattered from the gunshot during the storm. The door had been kicked in, but smoke was already curling from the chimney. Tobias, the old hand who had stayed behind, had kept the fire alive. "Yes," she said, her voice raspy. "We are home." The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy peace to the valley. The news of Hale's death and the standoff at the line shack had swept through Blackwood like a prairie fire. The story shifted with every telling, but the core truth remained. Elias Thorne had ridden into the teeth of death for his wife, and the giant woman had fought like a lioness to save herself. The town's gaze, once filled with mockery, turned to a wary respect. When Elias and Greta rode into town for the hearing, no one laughed. Men on the boardwalk touched the brims of their hats. Women stared, not with disgust, but with a curiosity that held a trace of awe. The hearing was held in the drafty courthouse, a room that smelled of dry paper and tobacco. Judge Reynolds, a circuit judge with a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing, sat behind the high bench. Elias took the stand first. He spoke plainly. He told of the water rights, the deed, and Hale's relentless pressure. He did not embellish. He did not shout. He stood like a rock in a stream, letting the truth flow around him. Then, it was Greta's turn. The bailiff called her name. "Greta Hanson Thorne." She stood up. The chair creaked. She walked to the witness box. It was small, built for smaller men. She did not try to squeeze into it. She stood beside it, her hands clasped in front of her, towering over the clerk. Hale's lawyer, a slick man from Denver, tried to rattle her. He asked if she had provoked the men. He asked if she was truly a wife or, as rumors suggested, a hired laborer in a dress. Greta looked at the judge. She ignored the lawyer. "I was taken from my home," she said. Her voice was low, filling the room without effort. "I was bound. I was beaten. They planned to put me in a cage. They treated me like a beast because I am large. But I am not a beast. I am a citizen. And I am a wife." She looked at Elias in the front row. My husband came for me. He offered his life for mine. That is the only truth that matters here." The courtroom was silent. The judge looked at her, really looked at her. Over his spectacles, he saw the scars on her wrists. He saw the dignity in her posture. He banged his gavel, ruling for the defendant, Elias Thorne. The judge said, "The claim by the Hale estate is void. The grazing rights belong to the Thorne Ranch, and let it be known that any man found harassing this family will answer to this court." It was over. Justice was not a parade. It was a stroke of a pen and the bang of a hammer. But as they walked out into the sunlight, Greta felt the air enter her lungs a little easier. Yet, the scars of the mind do not heal as neatly as the scars of the flesh. In the quiet of the evenings, Greta still struggled. She would catch her reflection in the dark window glass, the broad expanse of her shoulders, the height that made the cabin ceiling feel low, and the old shame would wash over her. She worried that she was too much for Elias. She worried that now, with the danger past, he would look at her and see only the strangeness of her, the unnatural size that the preacher's wife had whispered about. She worried that her body, abused by the miscarriage years ago and now marked by the bullet wound, was a ruined landscape where nothing soft could grow. Elias saw it. He saw the way she hesitated before sitting in the fragile rocking chair. He saw the way she hunched slightly when she walked through the doorway. He did not make speeches. He was not a man of words. He was a man of wood and iron. One afternoon, Greta returned from the garden to find Elias in front of the barn. He was working with a draw knife, shaping thick slabs of oak. He had taken the wood from an old lightning-struck tree, the hardest timber on the ranch. "What are you building?" she asked. "A chair," Elias said, not looking up. "We have chairs. They are spindle-backed things," he grunted, "made for city folk. They creak when I sit in them. They are not fit for this house." He worked for 3 days. He built a chair with legs as thick as fence posts. The seat was wide and deep, sanded to a satin smoothness. The back was high, sturdy enough to support a heavy burden. It was not a delicate piece of furniture. It was magnificent in its solidity. He brought it into the cabin and set it by the fire, opposite his own. "Sit," he said. Greta sat. The wood did not groan. The seat held her comfortably, with room to spare. Her feet rested flat on the floor. For the first time in her adult life, she did not feel like she was crushing the world beneath her. She felt supported. Elias stood by the hearth, watching her. "You fit, Greta," he said quietly. "You fit here." He reached out and touched her cheek. "And I widened the doorway to the bedroom this morning," he added. "So you do not have to bow your head. You should never bow your head in your own home." Greta touched the arm of the chair. Tears pricked her eyes. Hot and sudden, he was rebuilding the world to fit her, plank by plank. "I love it," she whispered. "Good," Elias said. "Now, about the south pasture, I think we should run the steers there before the heat sets in." "What do you think?" He was asking her, not telling her, asking her as a partner. "I think the grass is better in the east," she said, wiping her eyes. "The water holds longer there." "Then east it is," Elias said. The seasons turned, indifferent to their small victories. Summer came down hard that year. The rain stopped in June, and the sky turned a relentless, dusty white. The creek dwindled to a trickle of mud. The grass cured on the stalk, turning brittle and pale. It was a time of hardship. The cattle grew thin, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. Elias and Greta worked from dark to dark, moving the herd to the highest pastures, searching for water in the deep crevices of the rocks. Then came the smoke. It started with a lightning strike on the ridge, a curl of gray against the blue, growing rapidly into a billowing column of black. The wind was blowing down the valley. "Fire!" Elias shouted from the corral. They rode out with wet sacks and shovels. It was a brutal, terrifying fight. The heat was a physical wall. The air tasted of ash and fear. Greta worked side by side with Elias, swinging a shovel to dig a fire break, beating the flames out with the wet burlap. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair escaping its pins, her dress soaked in sweat and black grime. She was not a giantess then. She was a force of nature. She lifted rocks that two men would have struggled with. She beat the fire back with a rhythmic, terrifying power. Elias watched her through the smoke. He saw her strength not as a spectacle, but as their salvation. He fought harder because she was there. They stopped the fire at the creek bed. They stood together in the blackened grass, leaning on their shovels, gasping for air. Elias reached out and took her hand. His palm was blistered. Hers was raw. "We did it," he wheezed. "We are stubborn," Greta said, spitting ash from her mouth. "The land tries to kill us, and we refuse to die." Elias laughed, a dry, cracking sound. He pulled her to him, hugging her soot-stained body against his own. He kissed her blackened forehead. "I would rather be in hell with you than in heaven alone," he said. As the summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn, they made a decision. The ranch was too much work for two people, even two giants, and they had realized something during the long, lonely nights. Isolation was not safety. Community was safety. They spread the word in town that the Thorn Ranch was hiring. But they did not hire the swaggering young cowboys who wanted to make a name for themselves. They hired Moses, an older black cowboy with gray in his beard and hands twisted by arthritis. He had been drifted from ranch to ranch, turned away because of his age and his skin. Elias looked at his hands and saw the years of knowledge in them. They hired Sarah, a widow from the valley below whose husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with two small children and no roof. She could cook and mend, and her children needed a home. And they hired Toby, a teenage boy with a clubfoot who had been living in the livery stable loft, mocked by the other boys. The ranch changed. It became noisy. There was the sound of Sarah's children laughing in the yard, the smell of baking bread, the low hum of Moses singing spirituals as he mended tack in the sunlight. It became a refuge, a place for the broken, the discarded, the ones who didn't fit, and in making room for them. Greta felt the space inside herself settle. She was not the only anomaly anymore. She was the matriarch of a family of outcasts. Then came the sickness, not a fever, but a morning nausea that sent Greta rushing to the basin. She knew what it was, and the terror hit her harder than the fire had. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling over her stomach. She remembered the blood. She remembered the pain of the miscarriage. She remembered the doctor saying her body was too big, too clumsy to hold a life. She did not tell Elias for a week. She walked around the cabin like glass, afraid that one wrong step would shatter the fragile thing growing inside her. One night, the fear became too much. They were in bed, the wind rattling the new, sturdy shutters. Elias was drifting off to sleep when he felt Greta shaking. He turned over. She was weeping, silent, heaving sobs that shook the mattress. "Greta?" He sat up, alarmed. "What is it? Is it the wound?" Greta curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest. "I am afraid," she choked out. "Afraid of what?" "I am with child." "Elias." Elias went still. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. Then a slow warmth seemed to radiate from him. "A child?" he whispered. "But I will lose it," Greta cried, turning her face into the pillow. "I am broken. Elias, my body, it is a landscape of scars. It crushed the last one. I am too big, too hard. I will fail you." Elias pulled her up. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. He held her tightly, rocking her slightly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice fierce in her ear. "You are not broken. You are the strongest thing I know. But if I lose it—" She sobbed. "If I cannot give you a family, you have already given me a family," Elias said. He turned her so he could look into her eyes in the dark. "You, Greta, you are my family. Moses, Sarah, the boy, we are a family. A child would be a joy. But if it does not come, or if it does not stay, we will grieve together. But you will not have failed. You can never fail me by being who you are." Greta looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was not looking for an heir. He was looking for her. She let out a long, shuddering breath. She pressed his hand against her stomach. "We will try," she whispered. "We will try," Elias agreed. The winter came down with a vengeance. Snow piled against the walls of the cabin until the windows were tunnels of white light. The world outside stopped, frozen in a crystalline silence. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon. The new, larger chair sat by the fire, and Greta spent the long evenings there, her knitting needles clicking. She was knitting tiny things, socks that looked impossibly small in her giant hands, blankets of soft yellow wool. Elias sat opposite her, repairing harness leather. They talked softly. They talked to the child. "You must be stubborn," Elias would say to her belly. "Like your mother. Do not let the cold get you. You must be gentle," Greta would add, "like your father." The fear was still there, a low hum in the back of Greta's mind. But it was manageable now. She ate well. Sarah made sure of that, fussing over her with broths and stews. Moses whittled a cradle from pine, smoothing the wood until it was soft as silk. The baby grew. Greta's belly swelled, tight and hard. She felt the kicks, strong, vigorous thumps that made her laugh in surprise. Late spring arrived. The snow began to melt, dripping from the eaves in a steady rhythm. And with the thaw came the storm. It started in the afternoon, a sudden drop in pressure that made the cattle restless. By nightfall, the wind was screaming around the cabin, a banshee wail that echoed the night they had arrived and the night of the shooting. Greta felt the first pain as she was clearing the supper dishes. It was a tightening, a cramp that wrapped around her lower back. She gripped the edge of the table. Elias saw it. He dropped the wood he was carrying. "It is time," he asked. Greta nodded, her face pale. "It is time." Elias moved with efficiency. He sent Toby to fetch the midwife from town. The boy rode out into the rising wind, his club foot not hindering his skill in the saddle. The hours that followed were a blur of agony and noise. The wind battered the cabin, shaking the timbers. Greta lay in the bed, sweat soaking her hair. The pains were coming fast, ripping through her. The old trauma surfaced. She remembered the doctor's rough hands. She panicked. "I cannot," she screamed, gripping Elias's hand. "It is stuck. I am too small inside." Elias wiped her face with a cool cloth. "You are not too small. You are vast. Greta, you are the mountains. You can do this." The midwife arrived just after midnight. It was Mrs. Gable, the woman who had once crossed the street to avoid Greta. She came in shaking the rain from her cloak, her face serious. She looked at Greta writhing on the bed. She did not look with judgment. She looked with professional focus. "All right, Mrs. Thorne, Mrs." Gable said, rolling up her sleeves. "Let's bring this baby home." The labor was long. Greta fought. She dug deep into the reserves of strength that had allowed her to survive the ridicule, the blizzards, and the bullet. She pushed against the pain, roaring her defiance at the storm outside. Elias never left her side. He held her hand, whispering to her, anchoring her to the earth when the pain threatened to sweep her away. Finally, as the gray light of dawn began to bleed through the window, a new sound cut through the dying wind, a cry, high, thin, and angry. "Mrs." Gable laughed, a sound of pure relief. "It is a boy," she announced, "and he has a set of lungs on him." She cleaned the child and wrapped him in the yellow blanket. She turned and placed the bundle into Greta's trembling arms. Greta looked down. The baby was red and wrinkled. His fists clenched tight. He was small, so small compared to her, but he was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes. She touched his cheek with her large, calloused finger. He turned his head and rooted against her hand. She looked at Elias. Tears were streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the fatigue. "He is here," Elias whispered. Greta took a breath. She felt the emptiness inside her, the space where the fear had lived, fill up with a love so heavy it anchored her to the bed. "I am a mother," she thought. "I am not a freak. I am the vessel of life." She looked at her husband. "We did it," she said, later that year, when the summer dust had returned to the yard. Elias and Greta stood on the porch of the cabin. The ranch was busy. Moses was leading a string of horses to the corral. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line. the white sheets snapping in the breeze. In the dusty yard, a toddler pulled himself up on the leg of the new chair Elias had brought outside. He was a sturdy boy, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination. He let go of the chair and took a wobbling step. Then another. He fell, landing on his padded bottom. He did not cry. He looked up at his parents and laughed. Greta stood with her arm around Elias's waist. He had his arm around her shoulders. They were a towering pair, two silhouettes against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the granite mountains. The wind was still sharp. The land was still hard. There would be more droughts, more storms, more winters where the snow piled high. But as Greta watched her son stand up again, she felt a peace as deep as the canyon roots. She was no longer the terrifying giant bride. She was Greta. She belonged to the land. She belonged to Elias. And most of all, she belonged to herself. Elias squeezed her shoulder. "He walks well," Elias said. "Yes," Greta answered, leaning her head against him. "He has good ground to walk on." They stood there, hand in hand, facing the Wild West together, no longer crushed by the weight of the world, but strengthened by the love that had carried them through every dark, too deep place. Thank you for listening to You're Going Too Deep. The terrified giant bride gasped. But the cowboy said, "I need to reach the..." I hope this story of Elias and Greta touched your heart and reminded you that love can bloom even in the harshest of soils. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your city or country. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of resilience, romance, and the untamed frontier. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. What did you think of Greta's journey? I look forward to reading your words.